بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أبناء الطلاب وزملائي أطباء الدراسات العليا، يسعدني أن أقدم لكم هذه الأفلام التعليمية التي تتناول الجانب العملي لمادة التشريح. فنشاهد الآن هذا الشريط على أمل أن يحقق الفائدة المرجوة منه مع تمنياتي لكم بالتوفيق. يقول الله تعالى: وقل اعملوا فسيرى الله عملكم ورسوله والمؤمنون. صدق الله العظيم.
Now we are going to demonstrate some of the parts of the limbic system. This is the gyrus fasciolaris, which is a small ridge of gray matter on the inferior surface of the splenium of corpus callosum. This gyrus is continuous anteriorly with a slender gyrus having transverse notches like teeth, and hence is called dentate gyrus, which lies on the medial surface of the parahippocampal gyrus and is situated under cover of the fimbria of the hippocampus. This is the splenium of corpus callosum. This is the posterior end of the cingulate gyrus, which is continuous with the hippocampal gyrus. And this is the body of the fornix just under cover the splenium. This is the temporal lobe, and this is the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle open. This is the dentate gyrus, which is a long, narrow strip of gray matter lying on the upper surface of the hippocampal gyrus under cover of the fimbria. This is the fimbria, which arises from the swollen anterior end of the hippocampus. This fimbria proceeds backwards to become continuous with the crus of the fornix, and this dentate gyrus proceeds backwards to become continuous with the gyrus fasciolaris. This is another specimen of the temporal lobe. This is the anterior temporal pole, and this is the posterior occipital pole. This is the hippocampus in the floor of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. This is its swollen, rigid anterior end and is called pes hippocampi. This is the fimbria of hippocampus passing backwards to become the crus of the fornix. This is the crus of the fornix lying in contact with the splenium of corpus callosum. It should be noted that the dentate gyrus lies under cover the fimbria, while the choroidal fissure of the inferior horn lies just above it. Through this choroidal fissure, the choroid plexus of the inferior horn protrudes into the cavity of the horn. This is the body of the fornix, lying over the thalamus and below the posterior part of the trunk of the corpus callosum. This is the thalamus, and this is the corpus callosum. This is the anterior continuation of the fornix, which is called the column of the fornix. It passes forwards and descends downwards in front of the interventricular foramen, which connects the third ventricle with the lateral ventricle. The fornix is continuous posteriorly with its crus, which lies below the splenium of corpus callosum. The column of the fornix is separated from the corpus callosum by a thin sheet of white matter called septum pellucidum. This septum pellucidum forms the medial wall of the anterior horn and the medial wall of the central part of the lateral ventricle. The column of the fornix curves forwards and downwards over the thalamus, from which it is separated by the choroidal fissure, through which the choroid plexus protrudes into the central part of the lateral ventricle. This is the choroidal fissure, and this is the choroid plexus bulging through the interventricular foramen. This is the interventricular foramen of Monro. It connects the third ventricle with the lateral ventricle. It is bounded posteriorly by the anterior end of the thalamus and anteriorly by the column of the fornix. The column of the fornix sinks into the hypothalamus to end in the mammillary body. At the level of the interventricular foramen, the column of fornix lies just behind the anterior commissure, which is a transverse bundle of fibers connecting the two temporal lobes together. This is the commissure section. This anterior commissure crosses the midline just behind the lamina terminalis. This is the lamina terminalis. The structures in this region from before backwards are as follows. This is the para-terminal gyrus, just in front of the lamina terminalis. This is the lamina terminalis. This is the anterior commissure. This is the anterior column of fornix. This is the interventricular foramen. This is the thalamus, having the body of fornix above it, with the choroidal fissure in between. This is the splenium of corpus callosum, below which lies the crus of fornix. This is the pineal body, protruding backwards above the tectum of the midbrain. This is another specimen with the septum pellucidum removed to show the cavity of the lateral ventricle and the choroid plexus lying on its floor. This is the choroidal fissure between the thalamus and the fornix. This is the body of the thalamus, and below it lies the hypothalamus, with the hypothalamic sulcus in between. This sulcus extends from the interventricular foramen anteriorly to the cerebral aqueduct of the midbrain posteriorly. This is the cerebral aqueduct. It lies between the tectum posteriorly and the tegmentum anteriorly. This is the tegmentum of the midbrain, and this is the tectum of the midbrain. Here lies the cavity of the third ventricle. Its lateral wall is formed by the thalamus above and hypothalamus below. This is floor of the third ventricle formed from before backwards by the optic chiasma, tuber cinerem, mammillary body, posterior perforated substance, and the tegmentum of the midbrain. In this region, note the following: the tuber cinerem, mammillary body, and posterior perforated substance are parts of the hypothalamus present in the floor of third ventricle. Now, let us demonstrate the third ventricle. It is a single ventricle present exactly in the midline between the two cerebral hemispheres. In this specimen, the third ventricle is specially dissected so as to show its two side walls and its cavity in between. This is the cavity of the ventricle, which is seen to be very narrow and is bounded by its two side walls. This cavity extends from the lamina terminalis anteriorly to the cerebral aqueduct and pineal body posteriorly. This is the lamina terminalis, and this is the pineal body. This is the cerebral aqueduct. The cavity of the third ventricle is traversed by interthalamic connexus, which extends between the two side walls. This is the cavity seen from above and is traversed by interthalamic connexus. Note how narrow the cavity is. The cavity has a roof, floor, and an anterior wall and posterior wall. Let us demonstrate its walls in another specimen. The roof is a thin layer of epidermis invaginated by the tela choroidi of the third ventricle. It is attached to the upper limit of the medial surface of the thalamus extending from the interventricular foramen anteriorly to the pineal body posteriorly. The lateral wall consists of the thalamus above, the hypothalamus below, and the hypothalamic sulcus in between. The interventricular foramen of Monro lies in the lateral wall just anterior to the thalamus. The floor of the cavity consists of the following structures from before backwards: the optic chiasma, tuber cinerarium, mammillary bodies, posterior perforated substance, and tegmentum of the membrane. Note that the hypothalamus lies partly in the lateral wall and partly in the floor of the third ventricle. This is the anterior wall of the ventricle, formed by the lamina terminalis, with the anterior commissure directly posterior to it. Notice the recess, which extends from the cavity downwards towards the optic chiasma. Its posterior wall is formed by the stalk of the pineal body. Now, let us demonstrate the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle is a big ventricle which lies in the cerebral hemisphere. It consists of a central part and 3 horns. Each horn extends into one of the lobes of the hemisphere. The anterior horn extends into the frontal lobe in front of the thalamus. This is the thalamus. The posterior horn extends into the occipital lobe behind the thalamus. The inferior horn extends into the temporal lobe below the thalamus. The anterior horn and central part of the ventricle lie under the corpus callosum and are closed medially by the septum pellucidum. In this specimen, the septum pellucidum is removed to show the cavity of the ventricle with 2 big swellings lying in its floor, which are the caudate nucleus laterally and the thalamus medially. This is the caudate nucleus and this is the thalamus. This is another specimen showing the septum pellucidum intact, thus hiding the cavity from view. This is the septum pellucidum incised and reflected to show the cavity of the ventricle lateral to it. This is the anterior horn. It lies in the frontal lobe. It is the part anterior to the level of the interventricular foramen. It shows the head of the caudate nucleus lying in its floor. It is triangular in cross-section, having a roof, medial wall, and a floor. The roof is formed by the trunk of corpus callosum. The medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum, and the floor is formed by the rostrum of corpus callosum and the bulging head of the caudate nucleus. This is the rostrum of corpus callosum. This is its genome. This is its trunk. This is a coronal section through the anterior horn of the ventricle. This is the anterior horn. This is the septum pellucidum. Forming its medial wall. This is the trunk of corpus callosum forming its roof. This is the rostrum of corpus callosum in its floor. And this is the swollen anterior end of the caudate nucleus bulging in the lateral part of its floor. The central part of the ventricle begins at the interventricular foramen, that's to say at the anterior end of the thalamus, and ends posteriorly at the splenium of corpus callosum, that's to say at the posterior end of the thalamus. In other words, the thalamus is related only to the central part of the lateral ventricle. It is also triangular in cross-section, having the roof, medial wall, and floor. The roof is formed by the trunk of corpus callosum. The medial wall is formed by the septum pellucidum and the fornix. The floor is formed by many structures which would be demonstrated in another specimen. In this specimen, the roof of the ventricle, which is the corpus callosum, is removed to show the structures on its floor. These structures are from lateral to medial. This is lateral. It narrows progressively from before backwards to end in a narrow tail, which lies in the roof of the inferior horn. The thalamus-striate vein runs in the groove between the thalamus and the caudate nucleus. The stria terminalis, which is a slender bundle of fibers, lying just medial to the thalamus-striate vein. Moreover, there are a part of the upper surface of the thalamus together with the choroid plexus and the body of fornix. Note that the choroid plexus passes into the central part of the ventricle through the choroidal fissure, which lies below the fornix. This is the choroidal fissure. This is the body of the fornix. This is the choroidal plexus. This is the upper surface of the thalamus. This is the groove between the thalamus and the caudate nucleus. This is a coronal section in the central part of the lateral ventricle. This is the trunk of the corpus callosum. Lying in its roof. This is the septum pellucidum and fornix in its medial wall. This is the narrow part of the caudate nucleus in the lateral part of the floor. This is the striate vein cut in section and lying in the groove between the caudate and the thalamus. This is the choroid plexus lying on the upper surface of the thalamus. This is the upper surface of the thalamus. This is the body of the fornix lying on the upper surface of the thalamus. This is the choroid fissure between the fornix and upper surface of the thalamus. This is the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. It begins at the splenium, that's to say just behind the thalamus, and passes backwards into the occipital lobe. It is also triangular in cross-section. Having a roof, lateral wall, and floor. The roof is formed by the tapetum, which is the fibers running laterally from the splenium of corpus callosum and then turns downwards in the lateral wall of the posterior horn. The floor forms the infromedial wall of the horn and shows two elevations, the upper of which is produced by the fibers of forceps major and is called bulb of the posterior horn, while the lower elevation is produced by the deep calcareous sulcus and is called calcar avis. This is a coronal section in the posterior horn. This is the tapetum forming its roof, descending in its lateral wall. This area is formed by the forceps major, which comes from the splenium of corpus callosum. This lower swelling is the calcar avis. In this specimen, the lateral ventricle and its inferior horn are demarcated by a red line. The inferior horn is the curved lower part of the ventricle, which curves behind and below the thalamus to run forwards inside the temporal lobe towards the temporal pole. This is the inferior horn. It is also triangular in cross-section, having a roof, a floor, and a lateral wall. The roof is formed by the stria terminalis and tail of caudate nucleus. The floor of the inferior horn shows two elevations, the middle of which is produced by the hippocampus, which is a curved mass with a swollen anterior end called the pes hippocampi. The hippocampus narrows posteriorly and shows a bundle of fibers on its medial border called the fimbria of the hippocampus. Lateral to the hippocampus lies another elevation produced by the deep collateral sulcus and is called the collateral eminence. Note that lateral to the hippocampus lies another elevation produced by the deep collateral sulcus and is called collateral eminence. This eminence is not clearly seen in this specimen, a variation which is common in the brain. Note that the choroidal fissure of the inferior horn lies just above the fimbria, and that the fimbria lies over the dentate gyrus. Note again that the fimbria continues posteriorly with the crus of fornix on the inferior surface of the splenium of corpus callosum. Note also that the two deep sulci project into two horns of the lateral ventricle. The calcarine sulcus sinks into the posterior horn to form its bulb, while the collateral sulcus sinks into the inferior horn to form the collateral eminence. Now let us demonstrate the corpus callosum. This is the corpus callosum. It is a mass of commissural fibers extending between the medial surfaces of the two hemispheres, lying nearer the anterior than the posterior ends of the hemispheres. It forms the floor of the longitudinal fissure. In cut section, it consists of a main horizontal part called the trunk, which ends in a free posterior end called the splenium, and ends anteriorly by making a bend called the genu. From the genu, the corpus callosum extends backwards to form the rostrum, which ends at the upper end of the lamina terminalis. The splenium is thick and rounded, and its fibers extend between the occipital and the temporal lobes of both sides. Its fibers, which run backwards in the medial wall of the hemisphere towards the occipital pole, form the forceps major, thus called because the fibers of both sides look like the forceps. Some other fibers of the splenium pass through the roof, the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, and then curve downwards lateral to the posterior and the inferior horns of the lateral ventricle. These fibers form what is called the tapetum. The fibers of the trunk of corpus callosum pass horizontally to connect to the parietal lobe and the posterior parts of the frontal lobes of both sides. The genu connects the anterior parts of the frontal lobes of both sides together. The fibers of the genu curving forwards towards the frontal pole form what is called forceps minor. Because they are shorter than the forceps major formed by the splenium. Other commissure fibers are the anterior commissure and posterior commissure. This is the anterior commissure. It crosses the midline just in front of the column of the fornix. It connects the temporal lobes of both sides together. Here lies the posterior commissure. It crosses the midline posteriorly, immediately below the root of the pineal body. Now, we will move to demonstrate the insula. The insula is a part of the cerebral cortex buried deep to the lateral sulcus. The cortex overlying the insula forms a kind of lids called opercula. A part belongs to the frontal lobe, a part belongs to the parietal lobe, and a part belongs to the temporal lobe. These opercula form the lips of the posterior horn of the lateral sulcus. Pulling these opercula apart exposes the insula, which is triangular in outline and is surrounded by a circular sulcus. The surface of the insula consists of sulci and gyri radiating from the stem of the lateral sulcus at the apex of the insula. This is the floor of the insula, exposed after removing its opercula. This is the circular sulcus surrounding the floor. These are the gyri radiating from the stem of the lateral sulcus. These are the middle cerebral artery and the accompanying deep middle cerebral vein running on the floor of the insula. Now let us move to the sections of the brain to demonstrate the basal nuclei. Let us start with the horizontal section in the cerebral hemisphere. The section is taken from side to side in the horizontal plane. This is the horizontal section. We have to define at first the medial and lateral borders, as well as the anterior and posterior ends of the section. The medial border is straight, but the lateral border is convex. The medial border shows a big mass of gray matter, which is the thalamus, while the lateral border shows the insula, which appears as flask-like in section. The anterior end of the section is nearer to the corpus callosum than the posterior end. Then we will take the thalamus as a guide. The cavity just in front of it is the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, with the head of caudate nucleus bulging into it. The genu of corpus callosum forms the anterior boundary of the anterior horn. Then on the back of the thalamus lies the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle, with the optic radiation sweeping just lateral to it and passing backwards to the occipital pole. Just lateral to the thalamus lies the internal capsule, which is a mass of L-shaped white matter. Its short limb is the anterior limb and lies between the head of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. This is the lentiform nucleus. This is the longer posterior limb. It lies between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus. This is the genu of internal capsule at the junction between the two limbs, and it transmits the cortico-nuclear fibers. The posterior limb transmits the cortico-spinal fibers, which are motor, and the superior thalamic radiation, which is the sensory third-order neurons from the thalamus to the posterior central gyrus. This is in addition to corticopontine and other extrapyramidal fibers. This is the lentiform nucleus, which is a part of the corpus striatum. The corpus striatum consists of both the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. The lentiform nucleus consists of two parts. The inner part is pale and is called the globus pallidus, while the lateral part is darker due to the presence of more pigments and is called the putamen. The lentiform nucleus is biconvex, thus resembling the lens or lenticle. The part of the internal capsule behind the level of the lentiform nucleus is called the retrolentiform part of the internal capsule. It contains the optic radiation for vision. The part of the internal capsule below the level of the lentiform nucleus is called the sublentiform part of the internal capsule, and it contains auditory radiations for hearing sensation. Just lateral to the lentiform nucleus lies a band of white matter, which is called external capsule. It consists of white fibers forming a capsule external to the lentiform nucleus, hence its name. The same is applied to the internal capsule, which forms a capsule for the lentiform nucleus, but on its internal aspect. Lateral to the external capsule lies a thin strip of gray matter called claustrum. Claustrum means barrier. It separates the external capsule from the white matter of the insula at the extreme lateral part of the section. This is the insula, and this is the lateral sulcus on the surface of the section. This is the anterior end of the section, This is the posterior end. This is the medial border, and this is the thalamus at the medial border of the section. This is the head of caudate. And this is the lentiform nucleus. And this is the internal capsule. This is the anterior limb of the internal capsule between the head of caudate and the lentiform nucleus. This is the posterior limb of the internal capsule between the thalamus and the lentiform nucleus. This is the geno of the internal capsule between the two limbs. This is the external capsule to the outside of the lentiform nucleus. This is the claustrum, and this is the insula. These are the two parts of the lentiform nucleus. This is the outer black part called the putamen, and this whiter medial part called globus pallidus. Now, let us demonstrate the coronal sections in a stained specimen. These sections are cut in series in the cerebral hemisphere from before backwards. The first coronal section is taken at the level of the geno of corpus callosum and the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. It shows the anterior horn and the head of caudate nucleus in its floor. Lateral to the caudate nucleus, at this most anterior level, there is neither lentiform nucleus nor internal capsule, but only white matter, because the caudate head projects anteriorly more than the lentiform nucleus. This second coronal section is taken behind the previous section and is taken at the level of the optic chiasma. This is the central part of the lateral ventricle, and this is the caudate nucleus in its floor. Lateral to the caudate nucleus is the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Then the most anterior end of lentiform nucleus, which is fused with the caudate from below and shows also transverse gray connections across the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Hence, the two nuclei form together the corpus striatum as it appears striated. This is the anterior end of the claustrum, and this is the insula. This third section is taken more posteriorly through the thalamus. This is the narrow part of the body of caudate nucleus in the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle. It lies lateral to the thalamus. Lateral to the thalamus is the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and more laterally is the lentiform nucleus. This is the claustrum, and this is the insula. This fourth section is taken more posteriorly in the posterior horn. Neither the nuclei nor the internal capsule are seen. By this, we come to the end of the gross morphology of the brain, and let us move now to demonstrate the gross morphology of the spinal cord. This is the lower part of the vertebral canal opened to expose its contents, which are the spinal cord and its meninges. The spinal cord is surrounded by 3 meninges, as the case with the brain. The outer tough fibrous layer is the spinal dura mater, which is partly attached to the bones of the vertebral column. However, the interval between the dura and the bones is narrow and is called epidural space. This is the epidural space which is artificially opened. It contains loose areolar tissue, semi-liquid fat, and a network of veins which correspond to the dural venous sinuses in the cranium. The spinal dura mater is formed of 1 layer, while that in the cranium is formed of 2 layers between which the venous sinuses lie. The 2 sites of attachment of the dura mater to the surrounding bones are to the back of the vertebral bodies and to the intervertebral foramina, where it sends out sleeves over the roots of the spinal nerves. These are the roots of the spinal nerves as they leave the spinal cord and pierce the dura mater to reach the intervertebral foramina. As these roots perforate the dura mater, it gives off sleeves around these roots. These sleeves become adherent to the margins of the intervertebral foramina. Each spinal nerve has a ventral root which arises from the ventral aspect of the spinal cord, and a dorsal root which arises from its dorsal aspect. This is the ventral root, and this is the dorsal root. As the 2 roots pierce the dura mater, the dorsal root possesses a spinal ganglion. This is a spinal ganglion close to the intervertebral foramen. This is another ganglion, and this is a 3rd ganglion. This is the lower end of the dural sac, which ends blindly at the level of the 2nd sacral segment. This is the 2nd sacral segment, and this is the lower end of the dural sac opened. This is the spinal arachnoid matter. It is very thin and transparent. The space deep to it is called the subarachnoid space, and is filled in the living by the cerebrospinal fluid. This is the dura mater to the outside of the arachnoid matter. The space between the arachnoid matter and the dura mater is called subdural space. This is the subdural space, and this is the subarachnoid space. This is the pia mater, which is a vascular thin membrane which adheres firmly to the surface of the spinal cord. The pia mater also extends downwards below the end of the spinal cord as a delicate thread-like filament called phylum terminal. This is the phylum terminal. It is surrounded by the roots of the sacral and lumbar nerves, which form what is called coda equina, from its resemblance to the tail of the horse. This phylum terminal pierces the dural sac below at the level of the second sacral segment to enter the sacral canal and ends by getting attached to the back of the coccyx. The spinal cord begins from the level of the foramen magnum and ends below at the disc between the first and second lumbar vertebra, where it ends in a conical part called conus medullaris. Due to this high level of termination of the spinal cord, lumbar puncture is usually carried out at the level between the third and fourth lumbar vertebrae.